Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 24th of January of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to start with Zaporozhye area, with Zaporozhye front line according to the Russian classification. This front line, when talking about the area from Velika Novoselovka to Novomikhailivka, this area used to be South Donetsk front line, but starting this week the Russians renamed this area or added this part of front line to Zaporozhye front line that started from Kamyansk to Velika Novoselovka. Now we see that Zaporozhye front line has at least two parts. The west part started from Kamyansk to Velika Novoselovka and the east part from Velika Novoselovka to Novomikhailivka. So this is a big Zaporozhye front line. Few days ago, and for the last few days, we were talking about the western part of this front line, about the Russian progress in this area and so on. And when talking about today, most of the Russian military experts and military sources are saying that the Russians completely stopped on this front line. Furthermore, some Russian sources are saying that the Russians were forced to step back. They couldn't penetrate the Ukrainian defense orders in Novoandreevka, Novodanilovka. They couldn't get the vicinity of Orekhov, and that's why the Russians decided to step back on their positions before this Orekhov offensive operation. But when talking about the eastern part of the Zaporozhye front line, today this front line has been activated by the Russians, and there are a lot of movements, a lot of very interesting situation on the ground. But to understand the Russians in near Ugledar, first we need to start from Pesky front line, to be more precise, from Vadiane. As you can see, the Russian sources map has been updated, and today we receive the first confirmation of the fact that the Russians managed to establish 100% control over Vadiane. This one, as you can see, this is very far from the north, from Pesky on the north, and that the Russians managed to establish control over the trenches that located on the north from Vadiane in this area. So you see, this is the first confirmation. The Russians are saying that this territory is under 100% control, but I believe that we are going to see the update of this area in a day or two when the Russians finish the clearing operation in this area. But based on that information, let's return back to the Western sources map and let's try to update this map, try to understand the real situation on the front line on the Pesky area. So according to the Russian sources, they have control over Opitne, they have control over entire Vadiane and over one trenches on the north that located right in front of Severne, the small town that located on the north from Vadiane. And then the Russian goes very far to the west. Let's return back to the Russian sources map. As you can see, they're complete the front line right on the above the middle lake, that above the middle lake in this area. So let's return back. So this is the front line, and this is the area that is under Russian control according to the information we have by the 24th of January of 2023. So this is the Russian progress. When talking about the Russian source map, as you can see, there are another trenches on the east between Avdiivka and Vadiane, and these trenches are still under Ukrainian control. The only trenches the Russians got is the trenches between Severne and Vadiane. So as you can see, the Russians are very close to Severne, and of course they will try to develop their offensive operation to the north, and they will try to take control over Severne, and then they will try to move further, and the main town in this area is Orlovka, because this is the area that Ukrainians uses to supply Avdiivka with manpower, ammo and shells. So this is the northern direction to cut and to encircle Avdiivka But now we are not going to discuss Avdiivka. The most important is that the Russians were able during the previous days to develop their offensive operation to the west on the north of Pesky in this area. And when talking about this area, now the Russians' main thing they want to achieve is to cut the Ukrainian supply in the north of Pervomaiska. That will allow them to continue their offensive operation from Pesky in the same direction, and this operation is about to take control over entire Pervomaiska. And this is exactly what they want to achieve during the next weeks, and by the fact that the Russians establish control over Vodyane, I believe that we can start counting days before Первомайская falls. And what is so important in Первомайская, and how is Первомайская connected with the situation near Uglедar? I will try to explain to you. First of all, the Russians need to take control over Первомайская because of one thing, because of this road. As you can see, there is a small supply road that moves to Nivolskaya. This is important fortification in the middle of the field, on the north of Krasnogorovka, on the south of Первомайская, that Ukrainians uses to for their artillery system, and using this area the Ukrainians attack Donetsk with artillery systems. And the most important thing, this is something like north gate of Krasnogorovka. So by taking control over this part of Первомайская, the Russians will be able to cut this road, and they will force the Ukrainians to step back in direction of Nitailova, and the Ukrainians will be forced to establish their position here. And the cutting of this cross will allow the Russians to increase the pressure against Nivolskaya, and sooner or later, also in a day or in a few, or maybe in a week, this small town will fall as well. And if the Russians are able to take Nivolskaya, then they will be able to continue their offensive operation to the west, and the most important town, or the most important road that the Russians want to cut, is the road that connects Krasnogorovka from the north with the mainland, or Kurakhova, let's say Kurakhova agglomeration. So let's call all these towns small village, Lesukrainsk, Tsukurina, like Girnik, like Kurakhova, and the west part of Marinka is Kurakhova agglomeration or Kurakhova fortification. And if the Russians want to take control over Krasnogorovka, first they need to take Nivolskaya, and then to cut this road by movement in western direction. There are a lot of forests, a lot of, as you can see, brushes in this area. In Nivolskaya, all this area, all these passes, all these roads are fortified, there are trenches, there are safe roads, and believe me, the Russians are able to use them in movements in the western direction movement. By cutting this situation, the forces in Krasnogorovka will lose their supply from the north. So this is that the Russians want to achieve. And the main thing is, it's just the fields. The main thing that the Russians want to do is to block Krasnogorovka from the north. They can't encircle it, they can just establish fire control. I'm not sure that they are able to establish physical control, but they can establish eye control, fire control, and to block supply of Krasnogorovka from the north. As you know, the Russians made a lot of attempts to attack Krasnogorovka from the east, from Donetsk, but all those attacks were repulsed by the Ukrainians, and from now on Krasnogorovka remains without even square meter that is under Russian control. When talking about Marinka, the Ukrainians still have a lot of positions on the west side, and they're not planning to give up. But the thing is, when talking about Marinka itself, there is a lot of videos and updates from the western part of Marinka that Ukrainians refuses to enter Marinka and refuses to continue clashes for Marinka, and a lot of Ukrainians are these days are giving up their positions and retreating from the western part of Marinka. That also means that in a day, in a two, maybe in a week, the Russians will be able to establish 100% of entire Marinka, and this is exactly what they need. And as soon as they do this, the Russians will start their offensive operation along these brushes, along this small back between these water reservoirs, and they will try to establish their defense position along these lines, and by attacking in this direction, they will be able to establish fire control over the railroad and over the road that connects Kurakhova fortification with Krasnogorovka. And from that moment, as soon as the Russians block the Ukrainians from the north and from the south, they will be able to start storming operation of Krasnogorovka. Anyway, they will have to do this, or the Ukrainians will be forced to step back, to retreat, because of high risk of being encircled, or the Russians will be able to storm this area. Furthermore, these days the Russians also made few attempts of attack in direction of Pobeda, and a few weeks ago I told you there was like first confirmation or first piece of information that the Russians established control over Pobeda, but for now, as you can see, it's this town remains under Ukrainian control, but with, like, as you can see, a chain of developments, a chain of attacks, of progress from the Russian side is leading to logical collapse of Pobeda as well. And of course, the Russians need this town for one purpose: to increase the pressure of the Russians on Konstantinovka Novomikhailivka line, over this defense line. And so as you can see, according to this situation, I'm not talking about Krasnogorovka. This is completely different and parallel story. We will see, I believe, the storm of Krasnogorovka at the same time and the same way with Ugledar and this line. But the most important is few towns is Vadiana. This town is already taken. Nivolska, I believe that soon the Russians will take, because of this cross is already under control. Marinka, just for one reason: to release the Ukrainian forces, the Russian forces, in direction of Pobeda, for one purpose: to increase the pressure against this line. And now we are around Ugledar. When talking about the Russian sources map, as you can see, there are a lot of differences between the Russian sources map and the Western sources map. And the main difference is that, according to the Russian sources, the towns like Pavlovka, Nikolska, Vladimirovka, Blagodatne are under Russian control. When talking about the Western sources map, you see that all this town, according to this map, remains under Ukrainian control. But when talking about other maps like deployment map and the Institute of Study of War, every single map confirms this information, that these towns are under Russian control. So let's update this map according to the information we have. So for now, the Russians controls all these towns and this area. And the thing is that now, these days, the Russians started their movement in direction of Ugledar, and by, let's say, by 7 p.m. of local time, the Russians made had at least 3 roads of attack. Let's return back to the Russian sources map. The first one from Nikolsk in direction of the residential area that located between Pavlovka and Nikolska. The second attack from Pavlovka to the north in direction of Ugledar. And there is a third road, but the Russian source map doesn't show this road. I saw this road from other sources. They are saying that there is another road a little bit to the west from Pavlovka in direction of this airport zone. So let's return back to the Western source map and update this area. So from Nikolska, the Russians attack in direction of this residential area, and according to the information we have, they established control over the south part of this residential area, and now they're moving to the north. And also they're moving to the north, but a little bit in the east from Ugledar, trying to cut the road that connects Ugledar with line Konstantinovka-Novomikhailivka. Another attack, according to the Russian sources and according to information we have, the Russians are doing from Pavlovka to the north in this direction. I don't think that the Russians are able to enter Ugledar in front from this area. And the main reason the Russians attack from this direction is just to force the Ukrainians to change their focus and to decrease the level of Ukrainian focus or their artillery attack against the road from Nikolska to the north, and the most important one from the west side, from this area. So these two attacks, like the most west one and the most east one, is the main roads of Russian attack, and they're trying to encircle Ugledar. But to do this, they need to have at least a few roads very close to Ugledar that will force the Ukrainians to change their focus. And meanwhile, the Ukrainians attacks or trying to pin down the Russians in Pavlovka in this residential area in Nikolska. The rest of the forces are trying to encircle Ugledar from the west, from the east, and maybe from the north. So this is the plan. And as I see, and of course I believe that the next 24 hours we're gonna see if the Russians are able to achieve some success, any success in this area, or this is going to be another operation that, as we saw in Zaporozhye, that according to some sources the Russians got every single town in this line, but later we find out that the Russians haven't according to the Russian sources, of course, Minister of Defense of Russian Federation haven't reported about taking any of these towns. They just report about taking about Lapkova, and the towns like Sherbaki and many others were taken by the Russian military experts, but not by the Minister of Defense of Russian Army. And I believe that the next 48 or 24 hours will show us the real situation and will show us if it was a real attack or another fake direction or something like this. But when talking about all these operations starting from Vodyane and ending in Ugledar, I see that all these attacks, all these operations like Ugledar, Marinka, Vodyane is the small pieces of big picture of collapsing of Ukrainian front line on the line from Ugledar to Pesky or to Vodyane or to Avdiivka, to be more precise. And I see that this is an ongoing process. The Russians managed to achieve a lot of success in this area, and I believe that it's the time to complete or to finish this operation has come. And when talking about this area, when talking about Donetsk and Zaporozhye area, during the previous 24 hours, the Ukraine lost, when talking about Donetsk area, around 50 soldiers, around 2 armored vehicles and 2 artillery systems. They lost 1 Grad system and 1 Mstab B artillery. It's all howitzers and artillery systems. When talking about Zaporozhye, the Ukrainian losses is around 25 soldiers, 2 armored vehicles and another 3 artillery systems. 1 Akatsil, 1 D-20 howitzer and 1 D-30 howitzer. Furthermore, the Russians managed to destroy few ammo depot in this area, and everything is very interesting and very excited, so let's wait a little bit. I believe that even this evening we are going to receive more updates, and tomorrow in the morning we will understand if it's a real operation or it's a fake operation. When talking about the brigades that takes place in this operation, the same brigade that took control over Pavlovka, 155th Brigade, and now these days they're moving in the direction of Ugledar. So we'll see. Very interesting. Now let's talk about Avdiivka, Bakhmut and Bakhmut front line. As you can see, there are a lot of icons. Showing a lot of progress in this area and so on. And the most important is that the Russians, that when talking about Bakhmut, let's return back to the Western sources map, there are 3 roads left that Ukrainians are able to use to supply this town. The first one, N32, this one. This road moves through from Chasov Yar through Ivanovska to the southwest part of Bakhmut. The second road is the road that moves from the north part of Chasov Yar and then to the entered this road and entered the western part of Bakhmut. And the third road is the road that goes through MO3 road, then turns to the left, right, and we can find ourselves on the north part of Bakhmut. And today the Russians reported that 2 of 3 of these roads are under real fire control. As you can see, the Russians are very close, as everything, as we discussed, according to if you remember, we discussed many times the Russian offensive operation near Klishchiivka. Furthermore, as you can see, the Russians, as I told you, the next thing they are going to do from Klishchiivka after they take control over these trenches on the northwest, they will move into this forest line. They will try to establish their position, and from this position they will try to cut this road. And the Ukrainians asked and made some kind of announcement and warned people, military authorities and everybody in this town not to use this road anymore, because the losses on this road might be up to 100%. So I believe that somebody still uses this road, but I'm not there, I can't tell you, but I think that the level of usage of this road will reduce heavily. When talking about north part of Bakhmut, let's return back to the Russian sources map. As you can see, there are a lot of icons. The first one, and all these icons are saying that the Russians have significant progress in the area, in towns between Berkhovka, Paraskovievka, Krasnaya Gora, Blagodatnaya. The Russians stormed this town, this area, from 2 sides, from the south and from the north. I believe that maybe we can say about some kind of operational encirclement of this area. I'm not sure, but the only thing I'm sure for 100% is that the Russians have already cut the North Road as well. When talking about the Ukrainians, they destroyed the railroad bridge in this area. If you remember, during the previous weeks, they destroyed this railroad bridge. There was an explosion. Then there was another explosion. They were trying to clear this area. Today the Ukrainians destroyed this main railroad in this area, and now this road is blocked. The Russians are no longer able to use this M03 road because of ruins on the road, but it's not a problem, of course. As soon as they're able to push the Ukrainians back, they will clear this area and they will move along this road in direction of Slaviansk, Kramatorsk. But now I'm trying to say that the North Road is already under fire, and the losses of those who uses this road can be up to 100% as well. So there is just one road left that moves from Chasov Yar to Bakhmut. There is another living road or something like this. But you need to understand as well that this road is also under fire control. I can't say you that the level of losses of Ukrainians who uses this road, but I'm sure that it's not 0%. I believe that the Russians attacked this road 24 hours in a row with some pause and something like this, and the situation for the Ukrainians in Bakhmut became critical. But when talking about these days, as you know, the Western countries, the NATO or Pentagon suggested Ukrainians to leave Bakhmut because of very high risk of being encircled. If we are talking about cutting this road, so if we are talking about the situation when the Russians are able to get as close as possible to this road, it won't happen today or tomorrow. They need to pass the south, they need to pass this residential Ukrainian area on Yubileyny Street. We discussed this many times. When talking about the north, they still need to cross a lot of railroads, a lot of regular roads, also another residential area. So this is not a song of one day to get this road. But anyway, every single square meter the Russians getting closer to this road, they increase the level of losses of Ukrainians who uses these roads. So anyway, I believe that this is already something like operational encirclement, and I believe that in the next 2 weeks we are going to see a real operational or even maybe tactical encirclement of Bakhmut. When talking about the area between Solidar and Bakhmut, as we just discussed, according to the Russian sources map, they're making progress in direction of Paraskovivka. There are very heavy losses of Ukrainians in this area, and the Russians are trying to cross the railroad, the river in this area, and to enter Blagodatne from the north, from the town by the name of Dvurechne. And when talking about this area, if the Russians are able to develop their offensive operation from the south of Krasnogorsk, something like this, like I don't know how, but let's assume that the Russians establish this bridgehead, and if the Russians are able to establish another bridgehead from Dvurechne on the north of Blagodatne, that means that the Ukrainian forces who appears on this line will be encircled because there are no other roads. I'm not sure that there are a lot of forces, but anyway, this is going to be another collapse, another tragedy for the Ukrainians who appeared in this area, and they will be forced to step back to the north using the fields, local roads, or something like this. But anyway, this is not very good. As you can see, the Western sources map has been updated. The Russians yesterday reported that they established control over Krasnopolovka, and if you remember the previous version of this map, the northern part of railroad station Sol was under Russian control, even according to this map. But today you see that the Ukrainians, the Western sources, update this map, and now they shows that the north part of railroad station Sol remains under Ukrainian control. But according to the Russian sources, as you can see, all these towns, these two blocks are under Russian control. So let's update this area for better understanding according to the Russian sources. And when talking about the Russians on this area, there is, even if you take a look at this map, you're going to see some certain line of defense line, and this is the real defense line that the Russians need to crack as fast as possible. I'm talking about towns Bandarne, Khromovka, Vasyukovka, Sakovantseti, Mykolaievka, Razdolovka. Then we are moving to Veselaya and Bilogorovka. So this is defense line that the Russians exactly these hours, these seconds are trying to penetrate, and this is a vital area for the Ukrainians, because if this line falls, then we can find ourselves in Seversk agglomeration, in the vicinity of Seversk agglomeration. I believe that Fyodorovka, Perezhny, we can call is like it's already a vicinity, it's already Seversk agglomeration. So this battle for Seversk is going to start as soon as one of these towns falls, and then it's going to be a completely different story, because the entire defense, the entire offensive operation of the Ukrainians near Kreminna relies on Seversk. And if Seversk falls, or if Ukrainians are forced to step back from Seversk, the Ukrainians will be forced to step back from every single town, every single square meter that located on the north from Seversk. And when talking about Seversk and Liman and Kupiansk front line, according to the Russian sources and Ministry of Defense report, the Ukrainian lost on Liman around 30 soldiers, 5 armored vehicles, 1 artillery system in near Serebryanka M777 that Ukrainians uses to support the Russians in direction of Kreminna in their Operation Storm of Kreminna. And when talking about Kupiansk front line, the Ukrainians lost around 40 soldiers and something around 2 armored vehicles. Furthermore, during the previous week, the Ukrainians deployed another storm brigade near Bilogorovka. This is 81st Air Mobile Brigade, or to reinforce the forces in Bilogorovka, or maybe the Ukrainians are planning to start offensive operation in direction of Privilya, or just they want to secure their flanks while attacking direction of Kreminna. A lot of Western sources confirms that Ukrainians did a lot in front of Kreminna, in the vicinity of Kreminna, and maybe the next days the Ukrainians will, just to change the focus, just to change the situation in media, they will start doing something in Kreminna, because they can do this. For now, they can do this. When talking about Seversk, the most important area is the area that's located on the west side of Seversk. In this area, there is a small landfills, highlands in this area. This one, there are a lot of these areas on the hill that Ukrainians uses to control the area around Seversk. And the main artillery system in Seversk are located on the west side of these landfills, and they're attacking from the position that the Russians can see. They can't see this when the Russians were located, when we were talking about the previous configuration of the front line, when the Russians mainly were located on the line from Bilogorovka to Lysychansk oil refinery and Bilogorovka to the north. The Russians couldn't see the Ukrainian artillery system that located on the west part of Seversk. And this is the reason why this line is so important. If the Russians are able to penetrate this area and to establish control over the better solution, to establish control over the towns that located on the west from Razdolovka, Sakovo-Netsy, Vasikovka, Bandarnaya, Pozerna, then the Russians will be able to increase the the effectiveness and accuracy of Russian artillery duels against the artillery Ukrainian systems that located on the west side of Seversk, because the Ukrainians use Seversk bridgehead for many purposes, and the most important one is to suppress the Russians in Kreminna, suppress the Russians in Bilogorovka, suppress the Russians in Sporna, and to slow down the Russians on Solidar front line. This is the focal point. And if the Russians are able to establish visual control over this area, the Ukrainians will be forced to step back and to retreat from many towns. But there is one problem for the Russians, and the problem is Liman. It will be very difficult for the Russians to encircle, and for now it's highly unlikely to encircle Seversk forces, even if the Russians are able to develop their progress on the west-south in direction of all these towns like Alexandrovka and so on, because the Ukrainians now these days are able to use the pontoon bridges that they built on Seversky Donetsk River and to evacuate their forces to Slaviansk through Liman. So this is the main problem, and this is the reason why the Russians needed to be activated on the Kupiansk-Liman front line and to return the positions near Liman as fast as possible. This will give them possibility to encircle Seversk forces, but to do this they need somehow to penetrate the Ukrainian forces near Serebryanka forest, near Zarechna, and as we discussed, there are a lot of Ukrainians and they're just waiting the Russian offensive operation. There are a lot of forces there, Ukrainians, and they are ready. Believe me, they are ready. And this is the issue that the Russians try to solve these days. And during the day, there was a few attempts of the Russian counter-offensive operation in these forests. They sent their tanks, their Terminator, there are some squads to attack the Ukrainians, but it's a very difficult operation because it's very difficult to spot and find the Ukrainians in this forest. They can hide there, they can hide their armored vehicle, tanks, machine gun, sniper position, they can mine this area. So now the whole situation in this area, in Serebryanka forest area, plays in Ukrainian favor. And I believe that these days the Russians try to find a solution how to get as fast as possible to Yampol, because if the Russians are able to get to Yampol, they will encircle Seversk immediately, and this front line is going to collapse automatically. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.